for December 18th, 2019. On the agenda, and the second thing on the agenda is the announcement of Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Item number 3 on the agenda is the approval of the Planning Commission agenda. Anybody want to make a motion?
So moved to approve.
All those approve, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none, we'll move on to item number 6. Motion, approval of the Planning Commission meeting minutes on October 2nd, 2019, and December 4th, 2019. All those in favor say aye.
I'd like to just say I wasn't here on 10-2, so I'm going to abstain from that one. And I'll say aye on 12-4.
Okay. Any disapprove? Not hearing any, I'll say aye too, so we approve that one. Go on to item number 7. Approval of public hearing minutes for City Code Chapter 7B, Sign Regulations, Section 7B-310, I-35 Corridor Large Off-Premise Signs Code on August 21st, 2019. Anybody make a motion?
So moved.
I'll second it. All those approve, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none, we'll go on to item number 8. Approval of public hearing minutes. CUP Amendment Update Building Design, Bear Homes, 14744 Hornsby Street Northeast on October 2nd, 2019. Anybody make a motion to approve? I'll second it. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Hearing none, we'll go on to item number 9. Motion, approval of public hearing minutes, CUP for PUD for deviations to design standards, Viking Industrial 9203 Lake Drive Northeast on October 2nd, 2019. I make a motion to approve it.
I'll second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Hearing none, we'll go on to item number, it's approved. Going on to item number 10, continued discussion on land use versus zoning, enclosure and additional enclosure. Bulletproof number, want to go right on to it, Elizabeth?
I just want to make one announcement for item 10. So, at our last planning commission meeting, we had a presentation on the horticultural services concept plan. And while the applicants couldn't be here tonight, Sean Coveney is here tonight. He is in the audience, so if you've got questions, certainly he can be our resource. And tonight, we will have a short discussion using our work papers and then make a recommendation to the city council on that concept. I just wanted to let you know that the applicants could not be here this evening, but they do have representation if you have any questions.
We set for 2 months in advance.
How do we want to do this homework here, Elizabeth? Do we want to go around and go what everybody said, or?
So what I thought we would do is, we would go around and talk about the 2 main pieces of evidence. In other words, the 2 main bullets of whether or not you thought that, as far as the land use plan, meaning the comp plan land use, whether you thought this was a fit, and then we'll go in our reasoning, and what Ben was going to do is he's going to write it up in more of a format for a recommendation, because we don't have a staff report, because we really didn't have a chance to discuss what your reasoning was. And then coming outside of that, Jody, I think you're the one who is presenting to the council. So whoever does that presentation, you'll work with Ben, and we'll get a short summary, you know what I mean, of what the recommendation is coming out of our discussion today. Not that we won't have a conclusion, but it'll actually be written up with all of your points and reasoning for it. So questions about the homework, questions that you have for Dean and I, just about process or things that you didn't understand before we go into the actual concept?
Oh, no, I've taken that.
I did have a question on the minutes for the meeting, where it said the building site would need to house all the vehicles and trailers and equipment. Now, by house, they just mean that it's going to be on the lot because they aren't building a building for those. Right.
The clarification was that they were not gonna store the equipment in the shop. That they were going to be stored outside.
Yeah, that's the way I understood it, but it seemed different in writing it that way. So I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. So does someone want to start on what they did as far as looking at overall comparing the land use to this particular presentation?
Sure. What I did first was definitely read the comp plan and looking at the different districts, where it fit in my view. And then I went through the ordinances in the general zoning to see what I felt. So I know they want to be in a commercial showroom, and what I felt and my reasoning is that it really fits into the industrial area and not in the commercial showroom. Part of that is, I know that they spoke a lot about that they're providing a service, and I get that. But my understanding, or the way I interpret the CS district, is it's more professional, mixed-use type. But the biggest thing is the retail aspect of it, that the commercial showroom is a retail district. And even though they say there's a service with the outdoor storage of vehicles, and their business in nature is, to me, more in the industrial, because I feel it fits in as a contractor type development. So my evidence really, and maybe I don't understand enough with how they're doing it, is I say it's industrial, and mostly because it's commercial trucks and trailers, and the land use is not, the business is not a retail nature. And that the use of the land is more for outdoor storage, in my opinion, which is not commercial showroom.
Great job.
Want somebody else to go next? I agree with what Chris was saying. I went with light industrial when I looked at the comp plan, then looked at the zoning and stuff like that. I thought, like Chris did, that we're looking in that area for retail, people coming into a business. And according to the applicant, it seemed like they'd have 12 people in an office there. But out of the 80 people, most of them go to Woodbury, where 90%, or to the North Metro. And what I see as a primary use that they want to use the property for is for storage and maintaining equipment. And looking at section 7A of 782 in a light district, industrial district permits, item B, it says contractor shops and storage yards. So that's the first thing I thought right off the bat. They're in the wrong area. And I, like Dean said at the last meeting there, that if we look at that, we're way down by more west is where the light industrial starts, and there's a lot of land use between that. So I thought to start, instead of amending anything and putting it way up there, it should be be in light industrial and go that route.
Just to piggyback off of him, I had the same thing of section 7A, 7A2E, stating that that's the light industrial area where this should be. And our description in our comp plan for the commercial showroom, again, same what everybody else has said, is the showroom aspect of it. I know there's that line where three-room storage is there, and they are not showroom, but somehow they are grandfathered into that. And it is in our areas that zone that is allowing that use there. So for them looking at that to say, well, we kind of are like that, it's because that's allowed, if it's allowed already.
Yep, that business was there before our current zoning.
Right, and that's why that's there, but it doesn't change that showroom is in that area. And I guess that's the point.
Well, I started with the address at 14384 West Freeway Drive, and I went through, like you recommended, the comp plan, and it said, identified the land use as commercial, and legally the zoning must be consistent with the comp plan, and the corresponding zoning is commercial showroom. And then, like everyone else has said, the designated showroom area is for the highest intensity uses. It encourages businesses that benefit from high visibility and higher standards in building and site design. For example, retail businesses, businesses with outdoor displays for retail goods for direct retail sales, and offices, professional building, indoor service and repair. And then I made the statement that horticulture services isn't a retail business. It's a landscaping contractor who provides services to clients off-site. And the primary use of the land is for storage of 35 trucks and 25 trailers, which requires more extensive land use and outside storage for non-retail goods. All of these trucks and trailers leave the site and return to the site every day, so that's a lot of traffic on that road, in my opinion. So the business isn't a retail destination, and the customers don't come there for sales. So that was my general idea. And it is better suited for the light industrial or commercial industrial. We do have another landscaping company in the commercial industrial district.
I think you guys got it enough, basically. But yeah, the land use, all of the research I did, the land use doesn't fit. It's, an off-site service business. It's gonna be a storage yard, small maintenance of vehicles there. Basically, it'll be a small building, low tax space. All outdoor storage, office headquarters, no showroom or retail. Should be closer, in my opinion, and from the comp plan to the, even to the current zoning would be that this would be more suited for the light industrial or the commercial, district on Lake Drive. Everything you guys said, that's basically what I have for you.
So looking at last meeting, as we went through our workshop, do you think, this helped, having going through the Dean's 101 zoning, having a concept come in, do you think that, because you would apply the same reasoning for almost every application, you would go through the same steps. So do you think this formula will work? And does it make sense? Because if you have more questions, we'll be happy to go through, with other applications, or if you didn't understand some of the words, or you want us to change worksheets, or however you want us to do it, to make it more clear when we review applications.
It's a good worksheet. It was a little hard to kind of decipher what you meant by, like, what's your evidence, or, are you it's general, so you kind of had to make your deduction and then go from there. But, if you just use this provided, if you are lost and you just get, I found when I kept getting, okay, in the comp plan, going back here, then you just go back here and it's right here for you. It's right
It
here.
is, very
So
much.
then it becomes a question of, do we want to change the zoning? No, we don't, because the summary on that is, we need that higher, larger tax base. There's such limited land left, and so.
I agree.
Yeah,
Well, we were already told we can't spot zone, so it's not
Right.
a matter of being able.
well, I didn't say we were spot zoning, but I'm just saying, changing the overlay or whatever the discussion, we could allow or, amend ordinances.
You could change the text,
They did a text change,
but
but
we
you know
don't
what I
want to
mean?
do that.
I don't want to split hairs.
Yep.
Basically, what I just want to say is that if we're very comfortable with what we have, and we have worked on these districts and these things for so long, even with those overlays, I don't know, I thought it was
I think
I
it
did
was,
too.
it was
Very
good too. Is
helpful.
that what the staff really does too?
Yes.
When we get the report from the staff, you've gone through all this before we get it, right?
Well-
Is this what you do?
I'm beyond worrying about the comp plan and zoning consistency, because that's what I do, I live it. So when any request comes in, it is the zoning ordinance. Look at permitted and conditional uses, or even interim uses in some instances. And it's pretty clear. I think you cited, Ron, if you read one of the first permitted uses in the light industry district, it talks about contractor shops. And the other thing that stands out in the commercial showroom is that outside storage is not allowed unless it's accessory. And with a landscape business or any kind of contractor business where you have a lot of storage needs, the storage is the principal use, and an office building becomes the accessory use to that. And so it's opposite what's really allowed. So I think all of the things that you said are true. I just go right for the throat right away and say, doesn't fit. And it's, again, it's just second nature to me. That's what I do.
When you use the term accessory,
Accessory.
accessory.
So you have a principal use of property, and then you have an accessory. In the simplest sense, in the rural residential district, the principal use is a home. Accessory use, you get an outbuilding. And our ordinance tells you how big you can go based on how much acreage you have. The way our ordinance is structured, there are not what I would call standard accessory uses, except when it comes to storage. We make that reference in certain areas. We use terms like the outside display of materials in the retail area and the commercial showroom are products that are for direct sale. So we have a limited outside storage allowed in the community retail, our highest intensity retail district, but it's limited to putting cases of pop, or bags of salt in the winter, or firewood next to the convenience store. We have a provision in the ordinance that limits what outside storage is actually permitted. So that's not even really an accessory use. It's just kind of a seasonal activity where you don't yell at them if they've got buckets of antifreeze right by the door, because that's what everybody wants. But you can't occupy more than half of the sidewalk and things of that nature. For a business that wants 6 out of 8 acres to store vehicles, that is a principal activity, and that's really only permitted in the light industry district or the commercial industrial district on Lake Drive. And so again, it's a little easier for me, but this timing blended into this whole discussion about what is the relationship with a comprehensive plan, since it is a mandatory requirement of Minnesota legislature to have one. We do pay attention to it. And later tonight, we're going to talk directly about the conflicts that are created as a result of your new comp plan within this freeway corridor and the things that we have to do by next summer. We touched on that 2 weeks ago in just a general sense. Tonight, I want to focus on very specific, exactly those 7 areas in the comp plan that require change.
Here's my question. So you got Waldock's commercial light area, all his vehicles parked out there that they're converting. And you got Gander Mountain, with all their vehicles out there. Are they accessories?
Right now, the permit, the amendment to the permit regarded when you have a 100,000 square foot building and our original permission for storing the vehicles was, first of all, merchandise for direct display. These are vehicles that are for direct retail sale. It's not like Waldock where you might have a service activity where you're fixing somebody's vehicle or you're remanufacturing components that.
Conversion.
It's different.
Oh, okay.
It's a different activity, but that's directly allowed in that zoning district. And right now, our consensus with Gander is they're in violation of their permit. So the extent of that storage, all of a sudden, you might say it went from accessory to principal use. However, the principal sale of merchandise is permitted in the showroom district. So Coach Trailers is an allowable use because that stuff is for direct sale. And with horticulture services, there's nothing for direct sale. It is a service business. It's a necessary business. It's just in the wrong location from a zoning standpoint. And that's what your job is. And so you did a marvelous summary, each of you individually, and you were all consistent with your conclusions.
Well, good.
So in a concept plan, you don't necessarily take a vote. You all, kind of indicated what you thought, and as a consensus, the applicant will take back your message to their clients. The city council will then get your consensus from Ben, and he'll gather up all of the comments, indicating that, and I'll just summarize that you're in consensus that it's not the right use for that location in that district, based on the comp plan and based on the zoning district requirements, or outlined uses in that district. So I think that is really, from a concept review, that would be the steps that we would do for any concept review. And I guess my question to all of you is, are you comfortable with the concept review itself? Some communities don't have concept reviews because they don't think they had enough information, or they don't want to make a decision without the entire application. But in this case, did you feel like you had enough information to make that decision?
I do.
I did too.
Yeah, I do.
And I think it gives the applicants, if they spend too much money or time or effort, or purchase property, that they know right out front what the city will allow, what the city can allow and can't allow.
Well, like Dee said, great job.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks
Welcome.
If you want to see it, I'll relay that message back to my clients.
Thank you.
Yes, but I want to do the,
No, well, you're welcome to here, just down the road a little way.
before,
Oh, I know. The
I mean, I don't know
traffic
if
on Lake
anybody
is
out
just
here
gonna
is
show
sitting.
us.
But even further down.
Yeah.
Can we
Even
do
across
that?
the freeway.
Otherwise, the rest of the
Down
meeting-
the freeway, drive a little further.
Yeah, we'll have to look into that.
For-
We really like this site, so
No, I think
we'll go to plan B. Thanks
There you
for-
go. Thank you.
Listening as well. Thanks.
Happy holidays.
Thank you again.
Oh, welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I know we have ordinance tonight, but I didn't know if anyone here was for public forum. So before we go into our workshop mode, did you just want to ask if anybody's here for
Sure.
open forum? Because it'll probably be an hour for our workshop
We're
discussion.
gonna move it then, huh? I don't know what I did with it, yeah. Never mind. I don't know why I lose all that stuff.
You don't
Many.
think we have any papers?
We're gonna go to item number 11, and open it up to a public open forum. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to step up and give their 2 cents? Myron, you wanna come up here, talk? What? You wanna come up and say something?
Let's eat first.
Oh, okay. Seeing that nobody approached, we'll close the open forum. Go back to item number 10, correct? Zoning district workshop discussion. DJ will be bringing materials. What's to you, Dean, huh?
So I handed you some materials. And I hope you appreciate it was like 8 pages instead of 80 this time. It goes, it really goes well with the information that you had received earlier. It's just an effort to streamline this. And instead of talking about generalities, identify specifically what these issues are. I have 2 elementary drawings that I handed out. They're 8.5 by 11. I blew up copies of the comp plan land use map. It's page 2 and page 6 in your handout. And they're numbered on page 2, and that goes along with what's on page 1, the summary of these conflict areas. The maps that Ben did, once he got back, are wonderful to look at, and they correspond exactly with the 2 maps I have. So instead of trying to determine if that's brown, or is it purple, or is it whatever color on my map, you're gonna look at a much cleaner document. So the 2 large maps that Ben, actually you've got 3. One is just the comp plan blow-up, and it says nothing. We can look at that in the course of the discussion, but the other 2 will say 2019 comp plan zoning conflicts. That corresponds with my page 2, and the second one is current zoning, and that corresponds with my page 6. So that's just the introduction. Give copies, I've got a handful of copies.
I got that right. Okay.
So you can follow us in the discussion.
So the one with the white outlines, that's
2. The other one's page 6.
This one's page 6.
correct.
Yeah, you can write that on, and again, you can insert them as you wish. You're aware, because we've been talking about the apartment project, that the one that I have identified as number 1, and I'm going to use Ben's map because then I don't have to turn my page. That is the northeast quad. That was changed late in the comp plan approval process to be a mixed-use district allowing high-density residential. And so that's totally new. The underlying land use designation in the former plan was limited to community retail. And our former description of community retail had allowances for senior citizen housing. But this now is a market rate family type housing that would be allowed in this mixed use district. So the inconsistency really is allowing a residential use in the mixed use district. The commercial uses that we're likely to ultimately recommend. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. We'll take 2 minutes.
So, I know we're talking about the mixed use. I'm not sure who knows or who doesn't know, but we were notified that the apartment withdrew their application, so Cami Holdings will not be developing the apartment building. So just want to let you know that pressure for the design standards, although we're still going to move forward, the design standards, that application has been withdrawn.
So again, from the standpoint of you being the keepers of land use and zoning matters in the city of Columbus, we knew right away, because you had a proposal for an apartment, that we had no standards. So that's you know, a red flare shooting up. We scrambled to make our zoning ordinance and ultimately our zoning map consistent with this new approved land use designation called mixed use high density. So number one, we started focusing on what kind of standards would be necessary for a high density residential use within that former community retail area. It still fits in the description in the comp plan and the zoning ordinance. The purpose for community retail would work well with the mixed-use commercial component, but it didn't have residential. So that is my number one conflict. It's identified on page 1. You have the map, you know where that is. Number 2, east of Hornsby. And again, you can look at the map, but the first thing I did when I started working with the city, understanding what the final comp plan was and jumping headlong into apartment standards, I had already looked at all of these conflicts. I started circling these in day one because while we had to deal with the apartment project, we had to develop ordinance standards within 120 days and review a proposal in that time frame. That's required by law. Well, what else is potentially going to happen if somebody came on a piece of property? In the old comprehensive plan, the area that's labeled number 1 was identified as industrial. And so we lost industrial property in the new document. So jump to number 6, page 6, which is the current zoning overlay. And that one might be a little harder to read, actually, with the colors surrounding them. If you look at my page 6, it kind of stands out. It just says light industry. So the current zoning shows all the purple to the south, but that piece of property we're talking about now presently is zoned light industry, and the underlying land use designation is red, meaning we have to create now a new zoning category that used to be purple or light industry, and now it's going to become commercial showroom if we don't create another district. So that's conflict number 2. Go back to page 1 again, and then we have east of 35, south of 145th. That's labeled number 3, and it is an area, if you're not familiar with 145th, that's kind of an east-west road that only exists on the east half of the freeway, and it kind of split the zoning and land use categories, if you will. There's a small area of upland that could be buildable. It had previously been designated as commercial. In keeping with the property to the north, and then we ran into this massive wetland basin in the old plan. That was kind of the location where we switched from industry to commercial. That little upland piece that you see on the north end of the box identified as number 3 is the only buildable portion of that. Then if you can look at Ben's map, much of the 80 acres to the east is unbuildable and further land to the south, and that's all owned by the watershed right now. So it'll never be developed. In any event, that becomes another conflict that we have to change. That is now going to become showroom. I said that backwards a minute ago. It's currently designated in the comp plan as the light industry, and previously it had been associated with the land in the north as commercial. I did say it correctly. Okay. Yeah. It can be confusing. Go to the west side of the freeway now on item number 4. I'm not certain at all what the history of this was. But what's labeled as number 4 previously had been light industry and is now shown as showroom. So we lost some light industry on the west side, and that requires at a minimum a zoning change, or in the course of these discussions, we can debate how we want to deal with it. Somebody mentioned earlier, maybe Barb, text amendment. You can do that, as long as the text amendment is consistent with the land use, and then it falls into now some sort of commercial zone. You could do that. You change the complexion of this area to maybe be a transition area between light industry and commercial. We'll talk about that later. Going north, item number 5 is what's known as the Priner Addition, Priner Family Addition. It's a platted area that on the north side of Zurich, or 147th, is already developed. Those were the senior citizen detached homes, townhomes. The parcel on the south side of the road is undeveloped, but had been earmarked and discussed at one time for high-density senior housing. So that also has been redesignated in the comp plan as a mixed-use, high-density area. It is likely, but I won't say it couldn't have a commercial component. It's more likely that it would be all residential and really no mixed use, but doesn't matter. That's the category. And so when we develop the new mixed-use districts, there will be a laundry list of uses that are allowed, and as long as that's one of them, it'll be developed. But it'll be unlike the northeast area mixed-use district, which we do anticipate having a mix of housing and retail uses. Conflict number 6 is 6 and 7 are similar in that in the former plan, they were identified as community retail. The difference is the zoning district for number 6 is horse racing. So the entire property was acquired by North Metro Harness Initiative, and this now will require a change from horse racing district to medium density mixed use. Whereas the area to the north is currently zoned as community retail, and that will change then to the medium density mixed use. So within the freeway corridor, we've got 7 specific properties, multiple parcels in some instances, that are going to require some sort of zoning action in the future, as well as text amendments to the zoning ordinance, creating at a minimum the high density and the medium density mixed use districts. If you look at my page 2 map, just because it included a little bit more of the city, and Ben's map was blown up so nicely to focus on the freeway corridor, you don't see Lake Drive, but a separate land use conflict here, not in the freeway corridor, is the area that I'll describe as east of Hummer. It also includes a couple of parcels to the north of 133rd? 35th, 135th, okay. And we've had no discussion on that, and I've had no direction. I took a stab, as you may have read in my earlier ordinance, to attempt to describe what on earth you were trying to accomplish with low-density mixed use. Take all of that with a grain of salt. I'm creating a placeholder in that ordinance because that will be required to be done. Whether it ever happens or whether you create something that the property owners in this case even want is yet to be seen.
Is that the man caves?
Yeah, we had a neighborhood meeting, so we are trying to make that area conforming. But we can talk about that area, but so between, Joe wanting to do some reverse man caves, and bringing a housing component, and the single-family houses that are existing there, and the duplex that's on, in the one area, we were attempting to make it legal, legal there. Now it's all legal non-conforming.
That area, as my map number 6, page 6, illustrates, that's the commercial industrial zoning, just like everything else on either side of Lake Drive in that part of the community. So in total, you've got 8 conflicts between land use and zoning that have to be rectified, and as we talked earlier, we don't do this in 9 months. They're not going to come and arrest us, but technically we should be done by next July. And that comes rather quickly because there's a lot of important stuff to go over in creating ordinances. So pages 1 and 2 relate to the same bit of information. Go to page 3. I got scolded appropriately for giving you too much information about the mixed-use ordinances. Again, from my perspective, knowing what had to be done, it was easier for me to wrap my arms around what the 3 mixed-use ordinance amendments were going to look like, and even more so, you might not think of it, but we don't have many places in the formatting of the zoning ordinance to put these zoning classifications. I spent a lot of time, again, creating placeholders for what ultimately has to be done, rather than being focusing at that time strictly on the high-density design standards for apartments. So what I did in this one is a little, again, this is only 2-page, not my original 13-page ordinance, but this highlights several of the components, none of the performance standards. So you won't see anything that's related to what property dimensions might be, what the building design requirements are and things. This is just the concept of how we would take those 3 areas, the high density, the medium density, and the low density, and get them in the zoning ordinance. Forget about content. This identifies what I've already done. So 7A 750 used to be the introduction to suburban residential. As a result of changing the comp plan to eliminate what previously was identified as a residential overlay within either the community retail in the northwest part of the community or the light industrial district, that was kind of a mixed-use concept that the Metropolitan Council got tired of and said, you need to make that more formal, and you have to provide evidence to us that you're capable of doing this housing rather than having this kind of phony or flimsy overlay in your comprehensive plan. So we don't have any overlay and we don't have any mixed use in the southeast corner. It all ended up in the northwest corner, and then we also created new mixed use housing components in the 2 high density areas. So this 7A 750 will ultimately eliminate the suburban residential zoning district. And that occupied very precious slots within the zoning ordinance to conveniently include all of the medium and high density district provisions. And then we had room at the end of the commercial / industrial zoning district to insert the low density standards. So I'm just going to walk through this so that, again, when you are forced to pick up that 13-page ordinance again, first of all got one that had just the high density design standards, so we could focus discussions on design only. This now is going to give you an idea, again, regardless of content, because we haven't agreed to anything, we're going to have something that resembles this. So 7A 750 is talking about both the medium and high density because they are both with public utilities, whereas the low density isn't. And Jacob, your attorney, at the time this was all happening, was making changes in the plan unit development ordinance and needed to make reference to these. And so I wrote this paragraph originally for him, and he's already in our plan unit development ordinance using the term mixed-use residential commercial districts. So the title of that subsection includes not just one zoning district. It is a discussion of the two, medium density, mixed use, and high density. And it describes certain things, what it is we're trying to accomplish, the need to have a lot of performance standards. We want to minimize conflicts between commercial and residential uses. It makes reference to allowing flexibility through the use of planned unit development procedures. And so this is your new purpose statement in your worksheet that you looked at earlier tonight. Elizabeth had highlighted, and I think I included this in my earlier, this 2004 summary of our freeway corridor. Those are the current purpose statements that are still in the zoning ordinance. So these have remained. This becomes a new one that is really the foundation for your mixed-use districts. 7A 751 then goes into the discussion of, well, what are the permitted uses? And right off the bat, we say, you know, because we're talking about requiring planned unit development, requiring, not allowing it as an option, but requiring a PUD for every mixed-use project. You don't have any permitted uses. They're all conditional uses because that's how we process a planned unit. Probably my grandson, pardon me. It is. FaceTime from Kansas City. Shut him off. Got a call tonight. That's cool. Pretty good for 11-year-old. So in this case, the permitted uses are going to be limited. Again, if you look at my longer ordinance you originally received, there were maybe two. And then all the rest of them fall into the district conditional uses. Our task ultimately, and we'll get into some of this hopefully before the meeting is over, this requires you to come and say, all right, so that area for medium density used to be community retail. That's a great starting point. What were the uses in the community retail? First of all, why would we exclude them or why would we include them? One of the other things I've handed out previously is the summary of the Macomb study from 2015, which indicated you have no need from a marketing standpoint for any true retail uses in that entire medium density. So the majority of the community retail uses were kind of a laundry list of retail activities. If this becomes more of a service type retail, auto repair, whatever, it might be office / service uses like realtors, insurance agents, people that are often located in retail districts, but also operate well outside of them because typically the rent's a lot cheaper in a service commercial district than it is in a high intensity retail district, which is what we have left and we'll be focusing on around the interchange. So when you look at that ultimately, we're going to go back starting with the community retail and say, okay, so this has up to 16 units per acre. That could be, you know, some 8plexes or 2-3 story apartment buildings, not exceeding 16 units an acre. What's consistent with that? Well, it's not uncommon at that density to have a variety of retail or service commercial uses. You still don't want businesses that have a requirement for a lot of outside storage. I mean, that's never compatible with residential uses. So we still are looking at language that's already in your community retail and commercial showroom that talk about indoor, indoor, indoor. You know, the outdoor stuff is totally minimized. So that would be the focus in coming up with those conditional uses that you would allow in the medium density. I have a placeholder for interim uses. We used interim uses in all of the districts in the freeway corridor going all the way back to 2003 when this started, when we knew that we were going to create the public utility district, and yet the majority of all the properties here were residential. We had very few businesses. And so right out of the bat, an interim use was existing homes as of 2003. You can read that language in the ordinance.
But don't you think all of those, I mean, the other reason why we have the interim uses is we didn't have utilities.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
utilities are in 3/4 of the district, so don't you think we can
And-
eliminate almost all of them?
So when you look at creating something that is causing nonconformities, you say to yourself, what's the issue? And what Elizabeth just hit on is, this district has been a transition area for 20 years. Nobody had utilities. And a lot of properties that got utilities first were looking at, well, I don't know if I want to hook up and pay that terrible cost and then convert into. So many of these became legal conforming uses as interim uses, or however our references to all those nonconformities are. And right now, the reason I left that empty and said it's just reserved, it's a placeholder, I couldn't think of any reason to do this either. You're now declaring the intent of the community is for still commercial and residential uses, and you're being very specific about it, and you really don't want to prolong these uses. So if they're not identified as a legal non-conforming use, they still are allowed to exist. So you have legal and illegal non-conforming uses, and state law indicates you cannot get rid of a non-conformity as long as it doesn't change. So somebody lives in a house and it's now zoned medium density mixed use, it's not, we don't take them out of commission. Elizabeth gets a request from a bank because they want to issue a mortgage. She will say, it is a legal non-conforming use because we can't eliminate it. But it is now medium density, whatever. In the past, it was, she'd have to describe it was designated community retail, but it was also a residential overlay. So you're telling people that are looking at acquiring property, or even the landowners that are trying to sell the property, you're letting them know what they could do with it. And this has been going on for 20 years. And so this is, for this property in particular, this is a complete change in direction. Some still aren't going to find it helpful if nobody's acquiring their property, but we have to take the time to establish the standards in the zoning ordinance. If somebody comes in and says, yeah, I'd like to put a 16-unit apartment building here, we need to gear up for that, because it's going to happen someday. So the next section then are the performance standards, and I yanked all of those, but they are going to be in there. 7A 755 on the top of page 4 becomes now the high-density residential mixed use permitted uses. Here again, we don't see many permitted uses because we're requiring all proposals to be done through the plan unit development procedure, which requires them to be conditional uses. So all of the uses, and again, you're going to look at your community retail district now, and you may say, well, that location is included in the Macomb study as an area that is still valid for your highest retail use. So you say, why do we change any of the retail uses? Question I asked myself. You probably wouldn't. You'd say, all those remain valid. We gotta add one. We gotta have a residential component. So that will become an allowable use as a conditional use. And it previously said you can have an apartment up to 30 units per acre. Could be a condominium, it could be an apartment, it could be a cooperative. We have to allow all of those things because the comp plan just says you're gonna allow 30 units per acre maximum in that district. Well, it can be in the form of different things, most likely condos, co-ops, or just market rate apartments. Okay, so again, I don't see any interim uses at all in the high density area, and I've already written some of the performance standards but excluded them. I just want you to see how the uses are gonna be added to the zoning ordinance in response to the conflicts created with the new comp plan. So then we jump into a whole different section. It's no longer the 750 series in the ordinance. It's 796. 790 series included the commercial industrial district, and we had 2 or 3 slots left open. And so I'm proposing we occupy those with the low density mixed use. And again, I just, as a placeholder, I just noted in here that this still, as mixed use describes, is an area where we're talking about very low density and some sort of commercial use. We'll have to look at those commercial uses. Is this one area something where you want all of the uses that would be allowed in the CI district? Probably not. Again, if you're entering into the ordinance for the first time, a residential component, what do you try to avoid? A lot of the extensive land use items, outside storage, and a manufacturing activity that had a lot of noise. Well, you got a trucking business that's right there, and we've had some of the neighbors complain about the trucking activity. So, you're gonna have to deal with that. We're gonna have to live with it. But regardless of what your ultimate language for that low density becomes, this will resemble what we have to write up. I don't wanna spend any more time on it. I did, however, we need to keep the interim uses here because we do allow dog kennels in the entire CI district for residences that are in existence. I don't know if you have any that are licensed in that specific area, but the way the ordinance reads now, any of those existing homes would be eligible to have a dog kennel. I would suggest you're gonna leave it in unless you have a whole different concept on dog kennels. So that's the only interim use that I could think of in all of these. Well, I'm just saying, I flagged it so you see it. We can deal with that any number of ways. So let's go to page 5. And I'm gonna try to burn through the rest of this without getting into details because there's some repetition here. But as we look at the 2 basic uses outside of our mixed use, we've got red and we've got purple, and then we've got the mixed use in the freeway corridor. So we're really talking about, we have 2 existing commercial districts, community retail and the showroom. And we've had discussions about the nature of change in retail and other things. You want to read this information. First of all, we look at the community retail zoning district, and that shows up on my page 6 or on the bigger map that Ben produced. It's a fairly large area, and so we have properties all on the east side of Hornsby and some a little to the south of the Oxford edition that is excess property in the minds of the Macomb study that we need to dispose of it. Well, do you create commercial showroom or do you create a new zoning district? If you can't market this property as retail, because his comment is we can fit the next 20 years of all your potential retail land in the quadrants in the properties with the most proximity to the interchange. It's a very small area, and that map was included in my previous handout. So we have a large area of community retail, including the north side of Lake Drive and 40 acres on the south side of Lake Drive, immediately east or in between, say, Zurich and New West Freeway Drive. All of that was identified as non-retail, still commercial, but we don't have a commercial category unless you wanted to put this as showroom. So part of our exercise is going to be saying, what's missing? Do you create a district that might be more appropriate for those service-type businesses? Daycares. Daycares go where people are. If you've got a mixed-use district, I'd say that's going to be one of the first things you include in there are commercial daycares. That's a service business. That's not retail. But it would be allowable it already is allowable in the community retail district, but you might retain that as an allowable use. And I mentioned earlier, if you've got things like quick oil, rapid oil changes, if you've got, and they're predominantly indoor businesses, no outside storage, things of that magnitude. Certain auto repairs are all indoors, many others are not. And so you've got to be specific about that. And our ordinance right now has provisions for auto service businesses, but no overnight outside storage, things of that nature. So it's intended to be undercover. And those are the things you want to think about. First of all, within the mixed-use area, the medium density, but also large portions of the existing community retail are not needed for pure retail. So what do? You need to think about another district. So first of all, go in here and say, read the purpose, read some of the provisions, and then ask yourself, what other parts of the CR district, if we shrink it, would be appropriate for an existing zoning, and that's limited to showroom. And if we don't run showroom in that transition area right around the interchange, what might be a new district? We'll keep talking about that. The commercial showroom district. So tonight you had a proposal by someone that thought they belonged in a showroom district. Our current concept of that really is far from that. We set this district up as a big box district, in part because we had much more land available in the midsections of the district that could have had a 15, 20 acre user, which if it's no wetlands, you fit a Sam's Club or a Menards. So we were allowing the pure retail type big box. Again, a Sam's Club or Costco, you could have lumberyards. They're specifically permitted in here, where again, it talks about it's primarily an indoor business, but has some outside storage. Those products are for direct sale. The distinction between the showroom use and some other external storage that you might allow in the Lake Drive Commercial Industrial District or our Light Industry District where outside storage is appropriate. So if we have a large commercial showroom district, which was originally identified and created and the market seemed to exist 15 years ago for a lot of big box, we're already seeing the strain on, all the clothing retailers that have closed. Even our precious Dayton's and now Macy's on the fence, and it's going to keep changing. And so if you don't need the land for those retail purposes, first of all, the hardcore entertainment, restaurant, and high retail near the interchange, we got too much land for that. What do we do with the balance? Now we've got a commercial showroom district in the middle of the freeway corridor that is occupied by outside storage of RVs. It's a retail business that already went under that reopened and maybe is staying alive because of the retail sale of RVs. And what you've got to analyze, not only did we have in the old comp plan and our current zoning maybe too much retail, But now we've expanded the commercial district and shortened our industrial district in the comp plan. So then that raises a question, is it appropriate that you would consider some sort of transition? And let's just start with the areas that are purple. And if you have an outside storage business on the edge of the purple, and immediately north of that, in the old plan, it was all identified as purple, is there any appropriate transition use that might still be called a commercial use, but maybe allows some of the components of an industry? That's for you to think about. We've got to come up with uses under the current zoning descriptions that we have, and we only have 3 of those in the 3 square miles. That's a lot of land, and your homework then is going to be looking at page number 5 and focusing on some of these questions. I get silly at the bottom of this. You see Mickey Mouse highlighted there. This comes up all the time. Well, this is heavy industry, not light industry. Those are terms that are meaningless. It is what's physically written in the ordinance. You read what the uses themselves are. I will say most communities do try to use descriptive language so it gives you some idea. I mean, we talk about the showroom district. We know that's different from community retail. And if you had commercial 1 and commercial 2 and commercial 3, which a lot of communities do, you got to look them up every time because you have no idea what's, and ultimately then you say, oh, well, C1's our retail, C2's our showroom, and C3's our slop district. And it doesn't matter to me what you do. And when I say you can call it the Mickey Mouse district, I'm serious. You could. And you'll find another one of these on the page 7 coming up. And I'm going to leave you with instructions on how, like you did in advance of information for this meeting, go about yourselves and talk about what we might be thinking about doing. And it would be interesting for you to do this on your own and then come in and compare notes as we did tonight. So in this first one, I describe this as the non-retail community retail district west. So what I'm saying is you look in my previous handout, that Macomb map, and it identifies these areas. And I've tried to describe them pretty much. So Muddy Paws, properties north of Running Aces between Zurich and 54. You know, that's where Peterson Landscaping was with an interim use permit. And the property to the north, Viking Industrial, the Eco Fund site, those are all not needed for retail. So if that's the case, and then for a moment you tell yourself, well, I don't believe what Macomb's talking about, make your first list. What's your wish list? What do you want? And put them down on paper. And then I want you to do the same thing and simply say, if you try to pay attention to what people are telling us and what you see yourself in changes in the marketplace, what uses might work. If we're not going to get retail because the retail genius says there's no market for it, what might go in there? You might want to create a name for that. So first of all, what's the excess retail property now that we might come up with a whole new zoning district? What would you call it and what would the uses be? Don't worry about permitted versus conditional. Just what uses do you think might be appropriate? Go to page 8. I've used this term before. We've kind of lovingly called it the orphan property. So the city owns a net 5 acre, Elizabeth? About 5 acres of upland in the northwest quadrant.
Oh, yeah, 5.5, yeah.
Right here. So outside of the wetland, but it is a quarter mile from Lake Drive. In a lot of communities, I see this all the time, and I think you heard me say it, that's where a home store goes. Now, that's considered a destination retail business, and our retail study says that's not a destination site. I'm not gonna argue with it. You may say, let's hold out, and maybe a home store would go there. I'm just using that brand because they often are visible at the interchanges, and then you can't figure out how to get to them. They're very difficult. Whether it's Schneiderman's, Home, it could be any number of these. What's happening in the furniture business? There haven't been any new ones built in the last 10 years. They haven't been closing, so I don't know. But this piece of property, again, has great visibility. And we talked about, gee, do we have an opportunity for some sort of business campus? Well, it's limited to 5 acres. So it's hard to, it's hard to come up with what you might think is appropriate there. And as an exercise, I'd like you to do this yourselves and come up with your own thoughts about this. This could be a medical site. Again, I don't know that the market is here. And the way the medical industry is going, I could be booked out, but that's an option. We had a high-tech manufacturing facility that looked at that site and ultimately moved on. So there are a number of things, and I even gave you a name for this, the Minnie Mouse Orphan Incubator District. Again, that's to make you think about if you're going to use a descriptive name for a district, what would it be? Well, it depends on what uses you're thinking about. This could end up being I hate to use the term, but I've used it all my career, a slop district, where you have many things because you don't know what might hold possible. What we want to do is be certain that it is got a description that fits into a commercial use, not industrial, because that's what the comp plan calls it. We have a lot of latitude in that regard, so when you think about uses, don't start talking about production and manufacturing. Those are industrial terms, but you could talk about commercial assembly or high-tech. You come up with your own words, and that might give you help on even what you might want to call this if it became a separate zoning district aside from community retail or commercial showroom. We've got non-retail, community retail properties on the east side of the freeway. I mentioned that. You can see it on the map. These are properties that abut Halupsux, the city property, Oxford Edition, and it's identified again in our Macomb study as non-retail. The further we get south of 97, the more complicated it's going to be for retail uses. And so it may be appropriate to think about what uses go in on either side of Hornsby on the east side of the freeway. And again, think about if they're not true retail, what would they be? Not just your wish list. On page 9, I go into the commercial showroom. We talked about the west side, identified a handful of the properties, and I noted in here that some of these on the south end, west of West Freeway Drive, were redesignated from industry to commercial. And I think Elizabeth said earlier, well, it was just kind of lining it up equally on the east side of the freeway and the west side. I don't know that there was any thought going into it. What we're locked into without a comp plan amendment is coming up with uses that are going to fit into a commercial description. Now, having said that, there are uses, and different communities have a variety of different names, but highway business, general business, or general commercial, highway commercial, these are a hodgepodge set of uses that appear to have a mix of industrial and commercial uses. Traditionally, you may think about some of those portions of the commercial showroom area that might be suitable for a new kind of transition use that isn't really industrial, but isn't really retail. So it falls into that service business category. You're going to ultimately be plagued with performance standards. And that's going to get into the realm then of what we discussed last meeting after the presentation by Horticulture Services. Even if you allowed a certain amount of outside storage, should we be talking about percentages? How do you clarify that this is truly an accessory to a principal use? Well, if you got a 10,000 square foot building and then 6 acres of storage, it's a little backwards. So those are not zoning use criteria. Those fall into the performance standards and they'll have to follow. So when you hear me saying, well, should we have a transition use, maybe have a quasi-industrial use right next to industry that leads into the showroom, that's an option. But then you got to start thinking, how do we quantify that with performance standards? You're not necessarily dropping your guard about having higher performance standards for commercial property than you might with industry. We just have to categorize that differently. So that's a future exercise. Right now, I'm trying to get you focusing on, again, the connection between the land use plan and our zoning ordinance and the potential need, in addition to what we know. We need 3 mixed-use districts. That, at a minimum, are the new districts that must be created because of the comp plan. But as you look at additional information, the Macomb study, the loss of some industrial property here, are there new zoning districts that would be a subset, but a totally different district than commercial showroom that you might think appropriate? That's where we need to be by next July. So I tried to be as abbreviated as I could to take the 80 pages I gave you 2 weeks ago and the mixed-use ordinance that you saw in too much detail and put it into a format that just gives you kind of a global view of what we need to be doing without me telling you what's right. Questions? More frowns from Elizabeth, and she doesn't get any eggnog.
Frowns, I have no frowns.
No, there is no right.
No, and I think personally going through and answering some of these, what I have right now, because it's a lot to think about and start putting into real ideas that would fit in the land and transition.
There are other retail uses that fall into mixed categories. I heard somebody, maybe Shelley, I think she brought up, why can't we have a brew pub or whatever? Wherever, however many, you might say, why don't we put it in every district? Because that is a manufacturing and ultimately a retail use. There isn't anybody that makes craft beer or spirits that doesn't want to allow it for direct sale. And so, and that's not always the case. Montana has very strict laws about you can only stay open until 8 o'clock when you make your own stuff on site, unless you have a full restaurant. It's very confusing, it's very expensive, and that's because the casino industry owns the primary liquor distribution in Montana. We're not that messy, but the laws are changing here. And I just read in the paper the other day, the craft industry is going to get hit on the side of the head because whatever provisions they had for tax abatement is sunsetting immediately. And it doesn't mean we don't talk about this. And so everything's on the table. It's just at some point we get into what becomes practical. And we can't always operate on a wish list. It's what's going to happen. Because when we set the standards to a certain level, somebody's not gonna come in because they don't want to pay to meet our standards, because they can't lease property, commercial space, at the same rates they might in Edina or whatever. That is a real issue. We have a little different market here. We can't be everything that others are. You still have your desires, and, you know, you can go into this transition where, you know, maybe today these standards are a little less stringent than you might be able to get away with in 10 years. A lot depends on how this market is going to keep changing. It's an unknown, relative unknown. So you got service commercial uses, not retail. Had a proposal earlier about the true service nature of contractor type businesses. That has limited application in a traditional commercial setting. But you might have transition commercial areas that allow you to go from industry into a quasi, you know, it's almost like the commercial industrial district, but we'll come up with a different name. And it's allowable in the red areas of our new comp plan, but it's not community retail and it's not showroom. And that's for you to think about. We have a lot of vacant land, and the things that we do become consequences for the landowners themselves. If standards are too high that nobody will buy their property, what have we accomplished? The standards are too low and you get a mixed mash of junk, which concerns everyone. It is a constant issue for us to look at. And as I've always said, the day you adopt an ordinance is the day that the next day you start thinking about what's going to happen, you know. So we've had this commercial area since the early 2000s. That's a long time. And we've updated it, we've modernized the provisions several times, but the concept never changed. Now you got mixed uses, and that created an alternative for housing that you previously didn't have, along with the high-density mixed use. And so now we may have some surplus commercial land that doesn't fit in either showroom or community retail and is truly highway-oriented, more commercial industrial in nature, and how do we accommodate that if you do want to accommodate? So there's a lot of different districts you can come up with. So,
We got a hand up in the audience.
This comes under that part where you said Mickey Mouse, as far as defining what things are, but we had a problem with nobody having a definite idea of what retail is. Where does that come into the picture? Because if you remember, our lawyer said that retail was selling to an end user, and that was his only definition. Okay, and I said, well, you know, on the internet it says you also have to have like 70% showroom, and we were talking about percentages and stuff. So where does all this go in?
yeah, that gets into what I didn't even touch on tonight. I alluded to the fact that once you get the districts and the basic uses, then you have to get the devil in the details about things. Do you want to have, for the first time, minimum building requirements instead of maximum? So our ordinance right now says you can't have more than a one-to-one relationship. Your footprint of a building, and even subsequent levels, if it's multi-story, cannot exceed a one-to-one relationship with property. So if you had a 1 acre site, you could have a half-acre building. We have no minimum. And what we heard in the presentation earlier on this contractor business, 10,000 square foot building on an 8 acre parcel, gross underutilization of property. So that becomes a standard which you're talking about. How do you better define retail? How do you better define how do you categorize accessory? 10,000 10,000-foot building, and if we allow a one-to-one relationship with outside storage, then they get 10,000 square feet of storage, not 6. So it's standards like that, which are not uncommon. They're difficult only in the sense that the ordinance applies to everyone. And so think of another use in the same zoning district that would appear to be greatly penalized as a result of these standards. I don't have a good example, but again, all ordinances that I'm aware of, this has just been standard planning since I got into business, and it's called floor area ratio. And it was 1-to-1. It just meant that your building can't exceed the same unit of size of land. And that was a general relationship that works better with homes. So a relatively small city lot, and it's a 5,000 square foot lot, which is very small. The building could be 2,500 square feet, story. And that was the maximum that would be allowed. But no ordinances that I'm aware of had a minimum. And that is where Elizabeth was coming from with horticulture. How can you have an area that's got sewer and water capacity that we're reserving, and you only got a 10,000 square foot building on it? They're better served in an area that's got private sewer than public sewer. This is where the city of Lake Elmo got in trouble with the Metropolitan Council. Up until 10 years ago, all they wanted were 2.5 acre lots, no public utilities. Metropolitan Council said, we have capacity reserved for you in our sewer system. Our highways are being built for a community that would generate 160,000 vehicle trips a day, and you're generating 10,000. And they went to court, and the court said, you got to start having higher density here in Lake Elmo. Totally changed the complexion of that community. For better or for worse, those are the elements we're talking about, and what Elizabeth kind of lit up on with this particular use. Gross underutilization. Have our county and state highways accommodate the types of uses that our zoning ordinance would allow, and then a use like this comes along, and they could afford the property and say, oh yeah, well, we don't have, they got to pay their connection fees based on how many acres they had, but they're otherwise not making use of anything other than they're clogging the roadways with, vehicles, but they're not paying a representative tax. That's a slippery slope for us to go down to base zoning on all economic standards. It's very difficult. There are a lot of things that communities that are well-placed do because they don't get challenged, because people go along with it. My wife was the planning director in the city of Minnetonka, and when I started, I was down in Rosemount. Rosemount would have done anything to get business to come to that community. They had no performance standards. They didn't care if it was a chicken coop, as long as it came to their community. In Minnetonka, their ordinance didn't say it, but they required brick on everything. That's since declined because it's not the greatest place in the world to be anymore. But communities get away with things because the market says they can do it. So that's a different balance where you got to keep in mind what you want as a community, what your landowners who've been taxpayers, and this is a difficult area where we got one or more here right now that's been paying utility charges for 20 years, and they've been the stewards of the land, and then we create something that doesn't allow them to make use of their property. It's a hard pill to swallow. That's the tough balancing act that exists, and that's why you get paid so much. It's your problem to figure out.
You signed a private contract.
And get the rates.
Well, that was fun, Dean.
A lot to think about.
Yeah, I think Chris was right. We got to sit down
Think,
and absorb it.
yeah, start looking.
You can go back if you have, again, basic land use questions in the information I gave you 2 weeks ago. You can spend a little more time, because I copied the relevant portions of the Macomb study. It includes the map and the description. It gives you the total acreage that's necessary for retail, and that retail includes both convenience and destination business. So he's saying this is like your market based upon things that are happening within your subregion. That's the destination business. And because you're not a rooftop community, you have a natural limitation on the convenience. So while we want wonderful restaurants, would like a variety of bars and things of that nature, that's a rooftop, rarely a destination type business. I mean, there are some of us will go downtown St. Paul or Minneapolis specifically to go somewhere that's nice to eat, but for the most part in the suburbs, you have nice restaurants. They're either associated with major retail uses, a couple of those sitting in Lino Lakes, just off of 35, or they're in areas that are sustained by local residents. You haven't got local residents that support things like restaurants and grocery stores or drugstores. They're not there. When a place that has rooftops, and that would include Lino, maybe even a little bit of Hugo, and certainly Forest Lake, when they're providing that rooftop that would support your business, it's going to happen if they're not providing that. And there's no vacant land on Broadway. So that whole commercial area of Forest Lake is essentially done. You've witnessed in the last 10 years some redevelopment. That'll continue. But for the most part, you may have development options for retail uses on 61 and 97, but nowhere in between. And so you got businesses like Hy-Vee with their new hybrid business that are capturing travelers. And many interchanges, as you know, in the middle of nowhere where there are no cities, will have one or more sandwich stops. You got a lot of fast food already in your current market. It's hard to sustain those without your own rooftop. So that's why I say, go ahead and start out and have your wish list, and then try to get practical. Read what Macomb's summary is telling us about what your market really is.
Of course, it only takes something big to really stir the market up too, doesn't it?
Well, you know, you got high-tech corridors, you got all these things that communities compete for. We haven't got fiber out here. We have, you know, we're missing a lot of things that communities that get lucky with those big deals. You might, in the old days, it was getting a Saturn plant, you know, an automobile facility. And I don't, you know, you got too much wetland here. There's no room to put that thing. It's very hard for us to get a single user. You got the racetrack, but when the Vikings were looking at facilities and everybody was going, hey, come out here, there's just not enough single property massed together to support those enormous uses. So while that was going on and you got the racetrack as a true destination business, we were looking at the things that aren't right out here in your market, Sam's or Costco's. You already got Home Depot and you got Menards. There are some hybrid lumber yards. They haven't been expanding lately, and all of a sudden, I live near St. Louis Park, and the Sam's Club in St. Louis Park closed. They didn't rebuild. It was a fairly modern store. They just shuttered it. I was dumbfounded. So that concept is just changing.
I mean, they're building so many of them that.
I'm waiting for that bubble to burst.
I mean, there's just so
Honestly.
many, they're just all over the place, they're building them. No?
Yeah, and, you know, you have that market, but it's modest, you know, you're talking dozens of units, not hundreds of units, and family housing, I think, is still supportable in the community, but some of the questions that we had, and I think Elizabeth's privy to information that confirms this, the rent structure that they were looking at to meet our minimum requirements, which, you know, we were all arguing aren't that extraordinary, the design standards. Their rental structure was not supportable in the market. So if you take the rents down, who's paying for those costs in the project if the rent doesn't cover it? But I'll drive all around the region. I mean, I'm dumbfounded. I am on 394 all the time, and between Minnetonka, St. Louis Park, there are 5-story buildings going up everywhere.
Even downtown.
And
I
downtown.
mean, I was amazed, I was down there the other day, and I'm like, wow,
Yeah, if you go up into northeast, right around the brewery, right off Broadway, there's dozens of 5-story apartments going up. And by the way, they're not 100% brick buildings. When I go to my daughter's, I'm gonna stop and take a picture. You got some plain Jane stuff that our standards really were exceeding. So I think some of the information you may have heard about, you know, Minneapolis can get away with that. Well, Minneapolis doesn't get away with it everywhere. I mean, a lot of these are, they're all gonna start looking the same, no matter what you do. And this apartment building has been cyclical, as have townhomes and quads, you know. All of a sudden, the market's boom, and everybody's doing it, and then boom, the door just slams, and they stop building them. And
The senior housing market, though, has been pretty steady for a long time.
it has.
it's more
Yeah,
modest.
really.
It's more modest. It's the market rate stuff. Affordable housing doesn't go in spurts. It's hard to get tax credits assembled and make affordable housing work that's got some sort of subsidy attached to it. So those units have been steady. You look at the last 30 years and it's the same number all the time. It's not keeping pace with people's needs as senior housing, but most senior housing is also some form of subsidy. Not all of it. Questions? You're going to have this done before Christmas Eve, I presume. And when Elizabeth and I talked, we're not meeting that first meeting on January 1st, so we've got about a month till your next meeting.
We get one.
January 15th.
And we presume that you're gonna have some real business back on the agenda, but maybe
Yes.
not. So depending on how heavy or light that is, I would propose to pick this up and start comparing notes. And then take a minute to talk about what you still don't get about the process of accomplishing this. Not the details. Just stay at the big picture so you grasp what it is we need to do. And we're gonna really start worrying in a couple of months about the timeline, because July is right around the corner. Oh,
We're
Go ahead.
okay. All right, so bring your new ordinances here January 15th.
So it'll be workshop.
Workshop?
Christmas, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
Well,
No, a lot of good information. A lot to think about.
a lot of reading and trying to, one thing to have you blurted out, some of us are visual learners and some of them can read, you know, and that's what's hard about it sometimes. I'm more of a visual kind
I think we need time to process things.
of, yeah, but that last workshop was good. I
Yeah.
mean, I think I'm progressing. We go to item number 12? We done with this, or do you want to discuss it some more?
Nope, we're good.
Item number 12 on the agenda, City Administrators Report.
So, on the table, there were invitations for all of you, and then invitations from the mayor and council. So I know there was only a few of them, but certainly they'd like to have a holiday cheer get-together, so just want to make sure everyone saw the date and time that will take place. And for those of you who don't know, we're going to have an election on February 11th. So District 6, absentee voting starts next Friday. And so and I know there's not a lot out there. I'm not sure. There's only 2 candidates, but I'm not sure how much is going to be out there, but it is in our district. And then the presidential caucus election will be in March. So you'll get more information about that. So we do have elections. They're overlapping in the next couple of months. So we have that going on. Looking at the calendar, as Dean indicated, the January 1st is on a Wednesday, so we couldn't legally meet for a planning commission. So the next planning commission meeting is the January 15th, so there'll only be 1 meeting for that month. And at this time, we don't have any applications, and so we're beyond the window for that. That's why I indicated that we would do workshop. And with that, we're at the end of the year, and wish everybody a Merry Christmas. And boy, we're at 2020. Seems like a daunting year to have.
That's where your vision needs to be on zoning.
Voting, yeah.
Yeah,
I lost that a long time ago.
I never knew Star Trek would take hold, you know, with these little phones, you know. Waiting for them to beam us up now. Is that it, Elizabeth?
That's it.
Okay, the Planning Commission, item number 13, the Planning Commission's report. Pam, do you have anything?
I don't. Everybody have a nice holiday, a good break?
Barb?
Happy holidays to everyone.
Jody?
I have nothing.
Same here, I have nothing other than, is that gonna be on the agenda, that plowing snow over in the park?
Oh, on the park board, I think Lori has it on the agenda.
Okay, good. Well then, Merry Christmas to everybody.
You're worried about that.
Yeah, I'm getting tired of walking in the snow. My dog's getting cold feet.
I know, mine won't
I'm not
You're not gonna be here?
to the,
I'll be there. I know Chris is there. It's up to you, Chris. Do you want it? I'll take it. If Sam or Barb? Well, thank you.
You would have said, Chris, would you please do it? I was, oh, okay, but you know.
Oh,
You do such a.
no, well, I'm gonna have to ask him for some notes, because I missed a lot.
Ben's gonna give you notes.
Oh, okay. So, item number 14, motion to adjourn. Anybody want to make that motion? Anybody want to second it?
Second.
You sure you don't want to discuss this a while? All in favor, say aye. Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
I believe this is the first time before 9 o'clock.